Welcome to the Black Gay History Channel. Please share this video and subscribe to this channel for more captivating content. In a previous episode on the channel, I highlighted the story of Matelotage, or agreements between shipmates and other working men during the seafaring age of the 16th to 19th centuries, and how many of these agreements were likely some of the first legal gay marriage agreements in Western culture. Matelotage was a contractual agreement most common amongst pirates during that time period, and many experts have evidence that some of these agreements were between shipmates that had romantic and sexual relationships. Because of the homophobic academic culture of the 20th century, the homoerotic nature of piracy with nearly all male ship crews was less acknowledged by historians until now. Historic experts like American historian and PhD Hans Turley and B.R. Bergs wrote books that honed in on this particular topic. Hans Turley would expound on this in his book Rum, Sodomy, and the Lash, Piracy, Sexuality, and Masculine Identity, which was one of the first of its kind to deep dive into the homoerotic world of piracy. B.R. Berg's book Sodomy and the Pirate Tradition, which he published in New York in 1984, is another book that illuminated and detailed the few written Matelotage agreements between shipmates. Though most of these agreements were verbal, there were a few written Matelotage agreements written and preserved in records for hundreds of years. The agreements were to ensure that the shipmate in the agreement would get the other's property and riches after the other died, a practice that is still a part of most marital agreements today. It's likely that many European gay men would have preferred piracy to the military, particularly in the British Royal Navy, because though the Navy has always had a reputation for gay activity because of the lack of women on the ships, the Royal British Navy and other official militaries in Europe would have punished any same-sex activity that was discovered under the sodomy laws. John Bevis and Francis Reed were two pirate sailors who were in one of the few written Matelotage agreements, signed and dated on the 10th of March in 1699. The documents made it known that, quote, by these presents, that Francis Reed and John Bevis are in courtship together. Courtship is an interesting term for something that is all business and in no way romantic, isn't it? This agreement was written 300 years ago in Fort Dauphin, Madagascar, a Southeast Asian African island that had been colonized by Portuguese and French since the 1500s. A much more famous pirate pairing that is speculated by many historians and scholars to be romantic in nature is the Matelotage and cohabitation of the famous pirate captain Robert Culliford and John Swan. Captain Culliford was a famous British pirate with many famous adventures and exploits, especially throughout the Indian Ocean and the countries like India and many other Southeast Asian and African countries. One story about Captain Culliford and John Swan that would make a great movie is that the two were imprisoned with each other for 4 years until they escaped. In 1696, the two escaped their prison sentence in Mangalore, Bangkok, and they would find refuge and live together on St. Mary's Island, a pirate settlement owned by pirate Edward Welch on the southeastern coast of Madagascar. John Swan is notable in history not just because he's a pirate, but because many historians seem to allude he was Captain Culliford's lover, because the two would not only cohabitate, but the written notes of the time detail that John Swan was, quote, a great consort of Culliford's. The two would eventually split, with Captain Culliford continuing a pirating career in the Indian Ocean, and John Swan would move on to Barbados and eventually London. I think it's so important to mention that these men were in a possible romantic relationship and binding contract for several years, because the places they live this life are now all dealing with homophobic laws and social norms even today. Many Southeast Asian, African, and Caribbean countries are still struggling with homophobia today, but all these places also have something in common. They were all colonized by the British, who imposed these sodomy laws on their colonies in the first place. I've always loved pirate movies and lore, and since I descend from the Caribbean, the idea that pirate men were getting it on and even sharing wealth on Caribbean and African islands is a romantic idea. It's time we acknowledge the history so that we can dismantle homophobic laws in these regions and celebrate our queer histories.